Hey everybody, welcome to the channel. My name is Jay, and today I want to talk about She-Hulk again. She-Hulk Attorney at Law has officially wrapped Season 1, and as someone who's a longtime fan of the character and was hoping she would be included in the MCU, I have to say I'm very disappointed. I've already made videos discussing the first half of the season, so now I want to look at the second half. One of the main criticisms I get on these videos is that I talk about the comics too much, and that this is not the comics, it's a show. I do agree that you don't have to read the source material to enjoy a show that's based off of it. The problem is this doesn't even feel like an adaptation. Plus we've seen these characters and stories for literally decades, and they've been better than they're being portrayed here. I already talked about Jennifer and Mary, but even one-off characters like Mr. Immortal are much better handled in the comics. In the comics, he's more of a tragic figure. Immortality is kind of a curse. He outlives all of his relationships, and there's also consequences for him dying and coming back to life. But in the show, he casually offs himself whenever he's inconvenienced or annoyed, which results in him having a bunch of exes who end up suing him once they find out that "till death do us part" didn't actually apply to him. And it kind of feels like they're making light of a serious subject. I'm sure that wasn't their intention, but it still kind of comes off that way. I just wish they'd use the comics more as a blueprint, instead of taking these well-established and interesting characters and making them boring. There's a lot wrong with this show, but basically any criticism, no matter how valid, is written off as sexist. It seems like going into the show, the writers had a lot of really unfortunate assumptions about the audience, which they addressed in a recent interview. She-Hulk's actress Tatiana Mansley says that going into production she knew fans would not be accepting of a female superhero, but She-Hulk's been around for decades, and she's a very beloved character, and she's had many great stories and a rich character all that time. But instead of focusing on her history and catering to fans who actually love the character, as well as fans of the MCU who might be introduced to these characters for the first time, they just used her as a mouthpiece to dunk on people they don't like. And I do resent the fact that they're basically trying to speak for all women. Like when Jen says being scared and angry is a constant for women just existing. Yeah, thanks for that. But the show really suffers thanks to this "we have to troll the trolls" mindset. Jen's just not a very active protagonist. She tends to be strung along with whatever's happening on the show, instead of making things happen. She ignores obvious warning signs, and then is surprised when bad things happen. She doesn't get to make decisions that move the plot forward. Titania sues her, so now she has to deal with that. She's invited to a wedding, so she goes to that. She goes to Emil's compound and gets stuck there, so now she has to deal with that. And so on and so on and so on. Meanwhile, the bad guys are being active as they try to find a way to steal her blood. Jen learns fairly early in the series that people are after her blood when the Wrecking Crew attacks her and attempts to get it, but Jen never does anything about this. Instead, she lets the Wrecking Crew get away for no reason, saying that she has superpowers now so she's not worried. But the Wrecking Crew was hired by somebody, and if the direct approach didn't work, it's logical that they would try to change their tactics. But Jen seems to be one of those people that is too reliant on her superpowers, because she says she's not worried because of them, but they know who she is and they can hurt her in ways that aren't physical, or they'll try to find another way to get her blood, but for some reason that never occurs to her. But later she ends up at Emil Blonsky's compound because his inhibitor broke and the parole officer wanted her as backup, but then she's stuck there when her car is destroyed by two of the members. So while there, she ends up running into one of the members of the Wrecking Crew, Wrecker specifically. Admittedly, that's a stretch to call him Wrecker, but that's what he's supposed to be. You know, the MCU is often criticized for having lackluster villains, and the Wrecking Crew has a lot of potential for good storytelling. Instead, they're reduced to this. That sucks. But she comes face to face with Wrecker. She's very upset and wants to smash him into the ground, but where was this when the attack actually happened? She was so nonchalant about it, just casually letting them escape. But then Emil and the others at the therapy session tell her to calm down and go sit in the quiet chair, and it kind of feels like they're treating her like a child. Everyone even reacts like she's in trouble. I mean, she is coming in contact with someone who attacked her, but instead of doing anything productive, he just apologizes and they move on as if that's enough. If he were really sorry, he could at least give her information. And apparently he's a reformed member of the main bad guys, so even if he doesn't know everything, any information would have been useful. Instead, they talk about this guy named Josh who she met in the previous episode. She spent the night with him and then he ghosted her. It turns out that he was also working for the main bad guy and was just in it for her blood. I'm not entirely sure how he got it, but I also don't want to think about it too hard. But Josh's betrayal was kind of predictable because the show set up that anybody who shows interest in Jen is probably a bad guy. Pretty much the only exception to guys being awful in this show is Daredevil and maybe her dad. So the twist with Josh just wasn't really that impactful. Literally everyone she's gone on a date with has been a jerk. But the main bad guy, or group in this case, is an internet forum known as Intelligentsia, who have dedicated themselves to hating on She-Hulk She-Hulk. This is a not-so-subtle reference to the criticism the show itself has gotten over the internet. This show never misses an opportunity to make fun of internet critics.
My friend sent me a link to a video posted on that site, Intelligentsia.
The one for hateful man babies?
Yep, that's the one.
You know, in the comics we got interesting and formidable villains, even big threats like Dr. Doom, along with more realistic villains like the Mob. But here once formidable adversaries and also interesting characters are made out to be jokes. The Wrecking Crew are so forgettable that she had to remind us who Wrecker was. And Titania has no depth, she's basically just a petty nuisance. And the big bad are just internet trolls. Towards the end of the season, Jen is up for a Best Female Lawyer award, but she really doesn't deserve to be nominated, let alone win. She's a terrible lawyer. Not only does she not do basic things like prep witnesses and evidence before the trial starts, but she doesn't seem to really know the law. There's one case where she insists that people don't have the right to privacy, which isn't true at all. And that's something she really should know. It makes me wonder what other rights she doesn't think people have. And then ironically, in the same episode, Jen's right to privacy gets violated, which admittedly I think could have been avoided if Jen had been proactive. Jen unfortunately makes a lot of really big mistakes, but then never reflects on them. If they had gotten writers who could actually write courtroom drama and weren't so preoccupied with trolling the trolls, then Jen wouldn't have been so passive in her own story. Haven't they ever heard of Don't Feed the Trolls? Instead, they made it their priority to address Twitter and Reddit practically every episode, even if it made Jen look bad, along with Marvel and Disney, and even themselves, and everything culminates in the finale. So Jen wins an award for being the best woman lawyer, which she only won because she's the main character and clearly does not deserve. Anybody who argues that people don't have a right to privacy really should not be up for an award like this. But during her acceptance speech, Intelligentsia infiltrates the gala and plays a video of her having sex with Josh. She gets so angry that she destroys the screen and attacks the Intelligentsia members. This gets her arrested and imprisoned in the same cell that Emil Blonsky was being held in. But did Intelligentsia get anything for the crimes they committed? They broke a bunch of laws here. I also feel like this show relies too heavily on suing, and they don't seem to go after criminal charges. Anyway, Jen gets off with a plea deal to not transform into She-Hulk anymore. Her co-workers decide to infiltrate Intelligentsia since Jen herself is not proactive in this story. She just decides to go to Abominations because he's the only one who understands her or something. Only her male co-worker can actually go to the event, since it's only made up of males. Since the writers believe the only criticism is coming from misogynistic dude bros. So it turns out the ringleader of all this is this dude named Todd, who's shown up a couple of times. Jen went on a date with him earlier in the season when she was speed dating, but his whole thing is that he wanted Jen's blood so he could turn himself into a Hulk, and we get this nonsense. Anyway, to add insult to injury, it turns out Abomination has been giving pep talks to these guys, while actually being Abomination, despite the fact that he was wearing an inhibitor that was monitoring him the entire time. They also gave Jen an inhibitor when she got out of prison, despite the fact that earlier in the season she asked Bruce to make her an inhibitor, but he apparently couldn't, despite the fact that he's Bruce Banner. But now conveniently there's an inhibitor that works for her. And then the Hulk and Titania show up and everybody starts fighting. And then she brings up how ridiculous this whole thing is, but for some reason she doesn't bring up the inhibitor thing about herself or Abomination, because that's just a plot hole. You know, just because they point out that something is lazy or bad doesn't actually change the fact that it's lazy or bad. It's like that wedding episode. At the beginning she turns to the camera and basically says this is a waste of time, and it ends up being a waste of time. Literally the only thing of note that happens in this episode is that she meets Josh, but it was just filler in a 9-episode season where they could have used that time to actually be productive. And then Jen finally decides to do something about this, and she uses her abilities to break the fourth wall to go find the writers of the show. This whole season all she's done with her fourth wall breaks is give exposition to the audience, and now she finally does something interesting with it, although it is pretty basic. We talked about this way back in our video about Teen Titans Go and Thundercats Roar. Characters calling out the writers isn't all that groundbreaking, and she did do that in her comics, but they also got a lot more creative and fun with it too. Like she could have taken advantage of the editing and the fact that this isn't happening in real time, so she could have used it for fast travel or maybe even teleporting in fights. Instead she just beats up a bunch of Marvel security guards. I'm sure they don't get paid enough for this. So she goes to the writer's room and they tell her this is what Kevin approved, and that he's the big honcho around here. She demands to see this Kevin, so she forces her way into his office. But instead of Kevin Feige, it's this AI robot, who's just using an algorithm to make all these properties, because they have to remind us that Disney is a soulless, profit-driven corporation. So she tells him that she wants a bunch of changes and things to end in her favor, which he agrees to. So she goes back to her story, where Intelligentsia and Abomination get arrested. Daredevil literally falls out of the sky.
It's raining men!
and she gets her job back and decides to be a vigilante and a lawyer. And the season ends with her hanging out with her family and also Matt. And at this point, I just can't really be bothered. But then Hulk shows up with none other than Scar, who looks absolutely terrible. Seriously, the CGI is already bad, but what is that hairline? I don't think I've ever seen Scar portrayed with anything but long hair, so why didn't they just give him that? This was a really weird way to introduce this character, but basically Scar is Hulk's son from Sakaar. But remember back in episode 1 when that random spaceship showed up and forced them off the road? Well, apparently that ship was trying to pick up Hulk, even though it could have easily killed him by doing that. But basically during Hulk's time on Sakaar, he had a son. We're probably going to get World War Hulk content in the future, but this has to be the most lackluster introduction to a character. Honestly, this season was just a disappointment. As a longtime She-Hulk fan, this is definitely not what I wanted to see from her, and I don't think it's a good introduction to those who aren't familiar with the character. They were so hung up on internet critics that they went out of their way to troll them without actually considering the story. I wish they'd gotten writers who could play to the character's strengths, instead of people who just were not aware of things like the legal system, or, you know, superheroes. I also think it relied too heavily on cameos instead of letting the story speak for itself. They acted like the cameos were the main draw, instead of being a fun bonus. As for Daredevil himself, they did tell us early on he would be portrayed differently here than in his own show, and that Jen would be into him, so I kept my expectations measured for the way he'd be portrayed here, and I'd say they were met. I think this show could have been something special, but instead they made a bunch of assumptions and decided to stick it to a certain part of the audience that they didn't really need to acknowledge. She-Hulk has existed for decades and everybody loved her, but instead of embracing that, they decided to be petty and troll people, and they ended up making Jen a derivative character despite the fact that she never was prior to this. And I honestly do think it hurts the character and the MCU overall. This just wasn't it. But that's my opinion. What did you guys think? Did you enjoy this show, or were you disappointed like I was? Let me know in the comments below. I'd love to hear from you. Thanks for watching, everybody. I really appreciate it. Before I go, I want to give a shout out to our channel's members: Stutania, Tyrant Carnivore, Adam K, Shiny Orc Boy, The Rabbit Mancer, General Bolivar, Depth Charge Media, Samaru163, Gabby Hime, Sandy Martin, Verdant Range, Butcher7 Actual, Dash Hound, JVR, Hussyman42, Nixel, Eric Griffin, Phil C, Taylor Ramirez, Caleb Nelson, Bandito Bane, Hunter Rose, Dakari the Professor, Equestron, Owen Wildish, Norman Sweetcream, Way Beyond Coincidence, and Garcia XV Legend. Thank you all so much for your support. If you'd like to become a member, you can hit the join button next to the subscribe button. We also have a buy me coffee if you want to support us that way. But if you enjoyed this video, you can leave a like and subscribe to the channel, which helps us out a lot too, and it's free. Thanks again for watching, and I'll see you later. Bye for now.